All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second concurrent session of our time here together at the Boise Center's Virtual Graduate Student Conference on Pandemic and Religion. The way that I'd like for our time together to work today is very briefly, I'm going to introduce myself and my institution, and then I'd like to have each of the presenters also just basically say their name and their institution. And then I'll introduce Dr. Ospino by his biography so that we know who it is that we're responding to and who is responding to us. And then after I introduce Dr. Ospino by his biography, I'll introduce our first presenter, Dawrell Rich, so that he can also, we can also know his biography. Say again.
Dawrell.
Dawrell. See, this is why I wanted to do the names as we go around. Thank you for your correction. And after he's introduced, then we'll let him make his presentation. And then Dr. Ospino has suggested a sort of an order of presentation to have perhaps Lucy ask any questions that they might have about Dawrell's presentation. And then we'll do the same thing for Lucy as well. So I'll introduce them by their biography, and then we'll continue on. So let me just now give my basic introduction. My name is Nathan Woodhouse, he, him, his, and I am a fourth year doctoral candidate at Boston College.
Sorry, was I next? I'm so sorry. My name's Lucy Ballard. I'm a fifth year doctoral candidate at Harvard University studying Islamic studies. And I'm she, her, hers.
I am Dawrell Rich. I am a PhD candidate at Drew Theological Seminary in Madison, New Jersey, where my focus is on religion, society, and ecology.
Okay, now that we have our introductions, let me introduce our moderator for this morning. Dr. Hostman Ospino is Associate Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education and Chair of the Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. His research explores the dialogue between faith and culture and the impact of this interchange upon Catholic theological education, catechesis, and ministry. He has served as the principal investigator for several nationally recognized studies on how the Hispanic Catholic presence is transforming parishes, schools, and organizations. He has authored and edited more than a dozen books, including Our Catholic Children, Ministry with Hispanic Youth and Young Adults, Hispanic Ministry in the 21st Century, Urgent Matters, as well as the forthcoming Catechesis in America, a Continental and Ibero-American Perspective, Ecclesial Movements in the U.S. Hispanic Catholic Experience, and Cultural Diversity and Paradigm Shifts in Catholic Congregations. So now that we've had our introductions, Dawrell, I believe you'll be starting us with your presentation, so please, you have the floor.
Thank you, thank you. My presentation is entitled Masking a Shouting People, the Impacts of COVID-19 on the Black Church Experience. By way of introduction, as of this presentation, there have been a reported 105 million coronavirus cases worldwide and 2.3 million deaths. The US constitutes 26.8 million cases and nearly 500,000 deaths. COVID-19 shifted the landscape of every area of our lives. The impacts on our religious exercises have left us asking questions like, what does it mean to be in fellowship in light of social distancing restrictions? How do we worship together while apart? For those committed to being the, quote, hands and feet of Christ in the world, they have had to rethink outreach and missions in order to meet pressing needs within their communities while decreasing the spread of the virus. The role of celebration in preaching and among participants looks strikingly different as those in limited attendance, including preachers and congregants, wear masks to prevent respiratory droplets from traveling from a person with COVID-19 to others. For me, the phenomenon of preaching, singing, and witnessing through masks conjures images of masks in African societies. In this paper, I will explicate the role of masks within African societies to underscore their use as sociocultural and religious objects that mediate the spirit world. Using scholarship from academicians like Paul Wingert and experts like Segi, I illuminate how masked dancers incarnate the spirit of gods, ancestors, and more. The breadth of cultural sophistication inculcated in masks cannot be fully described in this reading. Yet I aim to put into words the vital role masks have had in African culture and the rise of the use of N95 respirators and surgical masks in light of the spread of coronavirus. Then I elucidate cultural productions among slaves like dance, drumming, and song to highlight how vestiges of African religious traditions and spiritualities came to American shores. The dance, drumming, and song signal the life and vitality of African religious traditions that began on the forest floors in Africa. Although mask wearing within Black church contexts is uncommon, the shout or dance remains. I conclude by exploring the role of celebration in Black religious experiences and the frenzy of shouting, which masks cannot cover. African masks. Scholars like Carol Finney note that masks within African contexts were used primarily for ceremonial and religious purposes. Masks donned by West and Central Africans represented gods, ancestral spirits, mythical animals, and more. Finley notes, quote, when worn as a part of a costume by a person dancing to music, a mask takes on a powerful symbolic meaning that is lost when it is viewed alone, end quote. In other words, outside of its context, what these cultural artifacts engender is but a semblance of what they really mean in light of the sociocultural and religious practices they were used for. I should note also that masks are not exclusive to African cultures, but have had a rich historic presence in various societies, including Greek and Roman civilizations and Native American tribes. Among Africans, traditional masks were used in private and public ceremonies as a tool to hide the face of the wearer and create a new identity, one that was often associated with the spirit world. As Segi notes, when the disguised dancer appeared in a religious ritual, the mask entered a new dimension of significance. Furthermore, the masked dancer who incarnated a spirit appeared mysterious. First, because his identity was hidden, and second, because he brought down to the group invisible but powerful spirits which influenced their lives. Masks also served a very practical purpose. Many mask-making African societies did not have written language. Masks and performances were one way for them to pass on their heritage. Then for African societies, masks and mask wearing was a sociocultural enterprise and religious expression. As late professor of art history at Columbia University, Paul S. Wingert offered, African masks, quote, function as agents of social control. For this reason, they conform to both prescribed general appearances and established procedures, end quote. Differences in basic style elements may exist between tribes and regions, but mask makers within said region would likely adhere to existing replicas of masks, as it is believed a design similarity allows the desired spirit to recognize the mask and come to dwell in it. The mediation the mask dancer engendered was a sacred performance that called for self-purification, sexual and dietary observances, and sacrifice. As a vital part of community, masks were worn during fertility rituals, funerals, initiation ceremonies, and more. Black religious experience. In slave religion, the invisible institution in the antebellum South, Albert Rabatel traces the history of the Black church from the forest floor, where dancing, singing, mask wearing, and shouting were pathways to divine encounters, to the rise of the Black church for a cultural maintenance and mediator of hope. Cultural and artistic productions represented a collapse in time where transient met eternal. Through cultural productions, contact with the gods and ancestors was possible. In fact, among the Yoruba and Fon, the Orisha and Vodun are called to take possession of their devotees by the songs and the drumming of the cult group, each of the gods having his or her own songs and rhythms. When mounted by their gods, the devotees dance to the accompaniment of songs and music, the distinctive steps revelatory of their gods. Then these danced religions evidence cultural motifs that define and describe community and allow for human divine encounter. While vestiges of African religions were retained in the New Worlds, the transatlantic slave trade profoundly disrupted cultural productions that defined community. A sophisticated and complex system of beliefs had existed within African religious traditions to the extent that there was no part of life that was not affected by God, Supreme Creator God, or venerable spirits. The variety of worshipful deities and symbolic representations meant a fundamental divine and human relationship. Then, torn away from familial, cultural, political, and religious expressions meant the fracture of identity, the fracture of self, and the protection and provision of their gods. As Rabatel states, they, Africans, were torn away from the political, social, and cultural systems that had ordered their lives. A new ordering emerged. For those who survived the Atlantic voyage, landing on the shores of the New World meant assimilating to new cultural and ecological awarenesses. Thus, for scholars like Rabatel, the emergence of the Black church is a response and production of Black resistance to particular sociocultural and historical happenings. In other words, the Black church is a sociological and theological production through which African heritage is retained. C. Eric Lincoln offers, quote, slaves not only worship with their masters or under the conditions of their master's control, they also held their own secret independent worship services in the backwoods and bayous of plantations. In Unfinished Business, Carrie Day argues that the Black church occupies theological and sociological space. For her, what may be described as the Black church is a combination of human community and self-descriptive theological claims. Yet, we should be careful not to define the role of the Black church as solely prophetic or liberative, because it has not been that for all, especially Black women and their bodies. The broad account of the Black church as prophetic space and historically engaged in prophetic activism overlooks how its male-dominated leadership has limited self-determination for Black women. While this paper does not expound on this point in depth, I included here to note how the Black church has been liberative space for some and not for others, namely Black women, who constitute the majority of attendees. Notwithstanding, what emerges during and after slavery as a result of Christian dominance is a religious expression that embodies African religious traditions and Black religious assimilation. COVID-19. The impacts of COVID-19 eerily resemble 17th and 18th century epidemics. In The Environment and the People in American Cities, Dorcetta Taylor provides accounts of yellow fever to underscore the impacts of transmissible disease and residents living in urban centers. Her account of deaths associated with diseases like yellow fever, cholera, and the bubonic plague are akin to the swelling tide of fatalities on account of coronavirus today. According to a report published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the spread of the virus was due to a combination of determinants, including but not limited to misinformation, slow testing availability, and public refusal to adhere to social distancing regulations. They note, quote, as a result of narrow case definitions and limited capacity for testing, the number of unobserved severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 infections during its initial invasion of the US remains unknown, end quote. Notwithstanding, by early March 2020, when only 1,500 cases and 39 deaths had been officially reported, and before a national emergency declared, researchers estimate nearly 100,000 US residents were already infected. Sadly, by the time concerted efforts were made to protect our citizenry, the virus was already spreading staggeringly. With that, it had caused enormous trauma, disrupted economies, social life, mass transportation, work, supply chains, leisure, sport, academic programs, literally everything. Religious institutions and communities were no exception. COVID-19 dramatically transformed the landscape of in-person religious gatherings. While CDC guidelines were not intended to infringe on the rights protected by the First Amendment or any other federal law, worshiping communities were advised to protect the health and well-being of religious practitioners by implementing strict guidelines, including but not limited to promoting good hand hygiene, covering coughs and sneezes, and promoting social distancing. Even more, attendees were encouraged to wear masks at all times. According to the FDA, N95 respirators and surgical masks are examples of PPE that are used to protect the wearer from airborne particles and from liquid contaminating the face. Just minutes from where I live, stay-at-home moms and retirees coordinated sewing circles in effort to mitigate the spread of the virus, while top brands like Under Armour and American Giant addressed the global need by manufacturing large quantities of masks. The growing need for protective face masks that may lower the spread of viruses means the mask industry is just beginning. If African masks evidenced cultural productions that spoke to the identity of the community, then what do our protective masks communicate? Conclusion. For congregations like those described in Frank A. Thomas's book entitled, "They'd Like to Never Quit Praising God," celebration plays a significant role in religious exercises. While this work specifically refers to the role of celebration in preaching, the principle of celebrative expression, which underlies Black homiletical treatment, extends to the entire worshipful encounter. Thomas defines celebration as, quote, the culmination of the sermonic design, where a moment is created in which the remembrance of the redemptive past and or the conviction of a liberated future transforms the events immediately experienced, end quote. All the same, I argue celebration is a pillar upon which the Black church experience rests. Celebration occurs prior to, during, and following the sermon. Liturgists invoke scriptures like Psalm 47:1, which reads, "Clap your hands, O ye people, shout unto God with a voice of triumph." These scriptures and more engage congregants' whole self during the course of liturgy. An embodied nature of performance is captured in the sermon and response in its hearers. Waving hands, dancing, shouts of amen are a response of the total person. As Du Bois puts forward, quote, "The preacher, the music, and the frenzy," end quote, characterize Black religious expression. Du Bois describes the frenzy of shouting as when the Spirit of the Lord passed by and seizing the devotee made him mad with supernatural joy, was the last essential of Negro religion and the one more devoutly beloved in all the rest. It varied in expression from the silent rapt countenance of the low murmur and moan to the mad abandon of physical fervor, the stamping, shrieking, and shouting, the rushing to and fro and wild waving of arms, the weeping and laughing, the vision and the trance, end quote. Here, the sociologist observes the embodied nature of Black religious expression. I offer celebration as expressed through shouting is a cultural production in response to divine encounter. The shout, as defined by C. Eric Lincoln, is a holy dance. The shout is to gospel what the ring shout was to the spiritual and slaves, and what spirit possession was to African sacred songs. The dance, as Lincoln calls it, is a cultural production induced by the Holy Spirit. Lastly, then what escapes most is that for Black religious folk, shouting is both verbal and danced. In essence, in an oppressive cultural context that privileged white voices and muted Blacks, shouters use dance as a means of communication with God in the same way that song and prayer are used. And shouters reach the highest level of worship when the Holy Spirit entered their bodies and took possession of their souls. I offer that for Black religious folk, the slow shuffle footstep and sway of the body is an alternative method of communication with God. While the landscape of the Black church and its religious expressions have been impacted by mask requirements, the encounter with God has not. For our dialogue has never been restricted to song and prayer alone. We dance, and masks do not cover our feet.
Well, let's offer Dawrell some claps, some wonderful praise for that presentation. Thank you so much. It was fantastic. According to Dr. Ospino's suggested sort of order of session, what I'd like to do now is have our other presenter, Lucy Ballard, offer some initial impressions of Dawrell's presentation. Just as a reminder, so you don't have to have it pulled up, Dr. Ospino asked, please offer an idea that you would highlight from Dawrell's paper. What caught your attention? What do you see as a creative theological insight worth exploring further? And once you offer us that reflection, before Dawrell has a chance to expound on that himself, we'll actually go back to Lucy for her presentation, and we'll all engage in that process once more before we can offer one another thoughts collectively.
Thanks, Nathan. Sounds good. Wow, Dawrell, there's so much in this paper. So I have quite, I have about 3 pages of comments, but I'm going to have to be choosy. So right off the bat, you immediately grabbed my attention with this tether between the cultural work and experience of African masks and traditional African religious life with the cultural work of these medical face masks that we're all wearing during COVID-19. That's so interesting. First off, it's just very creative. And so my comments here are going to reflect really my training in anthropology and religious studies rather than sort of theology per se. So your discussion of traditions like voodoo, in which masks are worn to channel new identities and invoke spirits, this reminded me of the notion of haunting. So here I'm thinking specifically about sociologist Avery Gordon has written about how the present is always haunted by the ghosts of the past, that sort of there are all these sort of traumas that are written onto our bodies. And specifically, she notes that hauntings leave people, her languages, with a sense of something to be done. So it comes with this kind of ethical imperative, like there's this presence and it has to be acknowledged and it has to be sort of appeased or answered. So a question I have coming out of this piece is, do medical face masks also invoke spirits in the sense that you were sort of speaking of around African sort of mask practices? So do face masks operate culturally within Black church traditions, not only, as you were sort of saying there at the end, as these like ineffective obstacles to the work of encountering God, but also as maybe like reminders of the spirits among us, the spirits of the 500,000 plus people who we've lost to COVID, millions more lost to sort of white supremacist violence. So that was one sort of point for me around sort of spirits and masks. And then the second piece I wanted to quickly highlight without going too long. I was also struck by your attention to gendered experience within the Black church. It comes up in two really interesting ways in your piece. So one question I have is, do masks sort of reveal gendered sociocultural norms or constructions in Black church traditions? So like you note that it has largely been women who have been whipping out their home sewing machines to produce masks for their family. This was definitely the case in my own family, my sister-in-law. So thinking about sewing as sort of traditionally women's work and the mask as we've seen sort of a signifier of certain kinds of gendered norms. In Black church context, what does it mean? What has it symbolized to wear a face mask? What values, positions, and identities does mask wearing signify? And perhaps also, how have leaders and lay people both tried to sort of shape these meanings or challenge meanings? And I'm thinking here especially about sort of early pandemic life when the mask was immediately turned into a sort of symbol of partisan political ideology. So thinking along those lines, so what's the symbolic meaning of medical face masks in Black church traditions today? And then the last piece, because I just can't help but say it. So I also was really intrigued by the entire theme of embodiment and celebration in your paper. So you present dance and embodied movement as these methods of divine encounter. You say the body is kind of like a tool for connecting with God. It's a means that can't be compromised by a prohibition on sort of verbal shouting. And then also, I didn't notice this on my first reading, but hearing you now, you mention celebrative experience as engaging the whole body. It's a response of the total person. And in terms of the paper I'm about to give, I think this is a really interesting point of connection there. But one final question I would offer just on sort of embodied celebration. It's kind of, for my reading, it's sort of intriguing to think about celebration in the context of pandemic life, because it's been so much about grief and loss. And so leaning maybe into a theological direction, if I might, I'm just intrigued by celebration as resistance. So what is the work of celebration in sort of channeling human resilience in this time? What's the relationship between celebration and life, celebration and survival? And has there been any sort of like pushback? I don't know, like, is this the time to be celebrating? Perhaps every time is the time to be celebrating. So these are some initial thoughts, but wow, what a paper, Dawrell. It was a real pleasure to read and hear.
Thank you, Lucy. Before we come to Lucy's presentation, I said that I would introduce our presenters by their biographies, and I want to honor Dawrell by doing that since I forgot to do so at the beginning. So Dawrell's biography is: Dawrell Rich is a PhD student in religion, society, and ecology at Drew University. His research focuses on the intersection of race, religion, and environmental justice. More specifically, he explores the role of religion and religions in social change and social movements, particularly with respect to racism, urbanization, just sustainability, and trauma. So I'd like for that to couch everything that we just heard. So let's now turn to Lucy for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Ooh, okay, let me get set up. If I'm looking over here, I apologize. I have my second laptop here to help me. So thanks everyone. It's great to see some faces. It's always good to be in community during this time of isolation. And thank you also to Dr. Espino, Nathan, Dawrell. I'm looking forward to the conversation we'll have towards the end here. I'm coming to you from the mountains of North Carolina where it's very windy and rainy. So I'm hoping I don't blip out today. So I'm putting in the chat really quickly in lieu of a PowerPoint, just using my Zoom tools here. So my paper involves a number of acronyms, and it's a little bit difficult to navigate. So hopefully this can serve as a little bit of a guide for you. So the title of my paper is A Scourge in Our Ummah, which is the Arabic word for community, especially Muslim community. So a scourge in our Ummah, wellness and racial liberation in US Muslim pandemic responses. So beginning in the earliest months of the pandemic, wide racial disparities in COVID-19 illness, hospitalization, and death were cataloged across the nation, with Black and Brown communities bearing the brunt of the virus's impact. Dawrell gave a very excellent sort of summary of the data there. The pressing medical emergency quickly became a reminder of the insidious everyday crisis of systemic racism in the US, as well as its intersection with economic inequality. So, as many states instituted lockdowns and mask mandates, the brutal murder of George Floyd by police ignited the largest mass demonstrations in American history, according to one New York Times article. And then also against the sort of looming backdrop and mortal threat of COVID-19, the rallying cry, "I can't breathe," gained new layers of meaning, naming both the kind of suffocating force of this new viral infection and racial oppression. So I'm calling this the kind of experience of living within co-pandemics. This is my sort of gloss there. So the intersecting crises of systemic racism, COVID-19, and also sort of economic crisis as well. So in this paper, I analyzed the intersections of religion, race, and wellness in the discourse of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, the National BMCC, and one of its parent organizations, the Muslim Wellness Foundation, or MWF. So I'll be using these acronyms quite a bit, so please consult the chat. So taking activist networks and nonprofit organizations as critical sites in which religious resources are interpreted, transformed, and acted upon, I examined the National BMCC and the MWF as purveyors of a unique discourse of Muslim wellness that responds to and interprets this co-pandemic moment as an invitation to new or renewed political consciousness and ethical practices. So drawing on theories of ethical and racial formation, I read Muslim wellness as a prescriptive project that leverages the dire intersections of disease and racism during this pandemic to propel a praxis of liberation and social responsibility into the mainstream of US Muslim discourse. So in some ways, I'm making both a kind of discursive argument and like untangling the meanings and implications of this particular concept of Muslim wellness as I see it thus far. And I'm also gesturing towards a kind of chronological story of change over time. So the impacts of a kind of an ongoing Muslim anti-racist movement. So anti-Black racism is an enduring problem within US Muslim communities as it is within our sort of global and national world. Muslims represent one of the most ethnically diverse religious communities in the United States, surpassed, I believe, only by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Sort of fun fact. So according to recent studies, Muslims who identify as Black or African American represent somewhere around 1/3 of the total Muslim population. But of course, entrenched patterns of division exist, especially between historically Black Muslim communities and Muslims of South Asian and Arab backgrounds for a variety of reasons related to sort of immigration patterns and socioeconomic status. But in general, Muslims of South Asian and Arab backgrounds are popularly cast as kind of prototypical or normative Muslims. The sort of stereotype in popular American culture is the notion that Muslims are brown, Arab, and foreign. Also, Muslims of South Asian Arab backgrounds predominate in positions of national and local leadership. So what this has meant is that sort of local mosques and national Muslim societies are often dominated by Arab and South Asian voices, which then subsequently means that issues around sort of police brutality, mass incarceration, and inner city poverty are often regarded as sort of not properly Islamic issues around which all Muslims should mobilize. So all of this is to say that the problem of intra-Muslim racism has been a huge site for Muslim organizing and activism over the last decade. And so the organizations I'm talking about today are sort of part of this bigger blooming of anti-racist organizing. So the Muslim Wellness Foundation specifically began as a grassroots initiative designed to eradicate systems of anti-Black racism within US Muslim spaces, and more broadly to center Black Muslim life as legitimate reflections of Islam proper. So really challenging these systems of ethnic normativity in which Black Muslims are often sort of find their dual identities as Black and Muslim sort of invisibilized and sort of attacked inside and outside of Muslim spaces. Okay, so as the full scale and threat of COVID-19 became apparent in the last weeks of March 2020, almost a full year ago, oh my, so Dr. Camila Mutman Rashad and Marguerite Hill, the respective directors of MWF and also the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, another of my acronyms, these two women joined forces to form the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. Now, this is a digital initiative designed to, according to their website, address the need for effective planning, preparedness, and organizing during this global pandemic. So acting as co-directors, Rashad and Hill have directed the National BMCC's work largely towards intra-Muslim educational outreach and Black Muslim advocacy in what they describe as rapid response to the very specific sort of social and communal needs born of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, since its launch on March 23rd, 2020, the National BMCC has done a number of things. They've hosted public webinars to educate leaders and community members about the intersections of COVID-19 and racism. They created a cool project called the Wisdom of the Elders Project, which sends Black Muslim youth to go talk with older Black Muslims in order to sort of collect their stories and combat elder isolation during the pandemic. And also, they've worked in collaboration with this much larger umbrella organization, the National Muslim COVID Task Force, a separate thing, to release several joint statements, especially on sort of medical issues around COVID-19, encouraging people to take vaccines, these sorts of things. Now, however, according to Rashad, all of these responses must be understood in terms of a broader socio-political and religious vision. So in her words, she says, all of our efforts are essentially geared toward wholeness. So in other words, the particular threat of COVID-19 for Rashad represents only one battle in this larger advance towards well-being or wellness, especially for Black and Black Muslim communities for whom these notions are linked inextricably to collective healing and liberation from white supremacy. So the precise discourse of wellness as it appears within the National BMCC program has been in development within US Muslim activist spaces for at least a decade, specifically through Rashad's work at the Muslim Wellness Foundation. So this organization was founded in 2011 by Rashad, who is herself a Black Muslim woman and a clinical psychologist based in Philadelphia. So the MWF focused its early work on reducing stigma, sort of general stigma around mental illness and addiction and trauma in the broader American Muslim community. However, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement sort of growing and the 2016 election, this targeted response to Muslim mental health disparities expanded in two directions. So the first was a much more specific focus on Black Muslim health advocacy and youth empowerment. And then the second was actually a broader sort of promotion of healing and the language is emotional well-being in the American Muslim community as a kind of multi-ethnic whole. So the MWF really sees its audience as the broader multi-ethnic Muslim community. And applying emerging scholarship on racial trauma, healing, mental health, and embodiment, MWF's program promotes a distinctly Islamic language and practice of holistic health in which mind, body, spirit, and society are connected in one great wheel of wellness. So many of us may be familiar with notions of wellness coming out of what's been termed popular American, like wellness culture. And in this wellness culture, it offers this projective vision of a transcendent self who can sort of rise above their delimiting circumstances to achieve personal fulfillment and, of course, also maximum capitalist production. If you just participate in enough sort of individualized fitness and soul searching and positive thinking. So MWF, however, I believe, presents a different kind of portrait of wellness by prioritizing the social as a key determinant of one's ability to flourish. So in a recent Instagram post, for example, Rashad explains the concept of social toxicity, asking followers, what are the social and cultural poisons that are psychologically equivalent to lead and smoke in the air? So here, systems of oppression, race, gender, class, religious hegemony, are not only understood as direct detriments to Black Muslim flourishing, but they're also sort of presented here as sicknesses in themselves. They're infecting communities and they require thus healing solutions. So as MWF and these other partner organizations understand it, healing is not a strictly sort of clinical term tied only to some neutral notion of physical health, but rather they say explicitly this is political in that it seeks to empower as active agents of change individuals who have been subjected to social traumas. So individuals within a racialized society, in this case, both Black and non-Black Muslims, must first kind of wake up, is their language, wake up to their need for racial healing by acknowledging their subjection within systems of power, and then recognizing healing as the sort of next step in this sort of communal process. So there's kind of this like prescriptive link between proper knowledge and consciousness and action. So I'm just gonna put one more thing into our lovely chat here. So this is a link to one major online resource coming out of MWF's work. And this, let's see. So this is an election wellness toolkit that was circulated beginning in mid-October of 2020 in partnership with Sapelo Square, which is also another Black Muslim education and advocacy organization. If you haven't checked out Sapelo Square, I strongly recommend. So the election wellness toolkit, I think, demonstrates really well this link between consciousness, healing, and committed action. So it was created immediately after then President Trump's comments in the September 29th debate, where he sort of gestured to white supremacists to like stand, what was it, stand up, stand by, something like that. Okay, so this was written in direct response to that. Specifically as a practical guide for US Muslim communities for how to prepare for the threats and uncertainties presented by the 2020 election, and of course, all of these other compounding co-pandemic crises. So the toolkit opens with an introduction in which a well-known hadith is cited. A hadith is a recorded saying of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's sort of held in high regard as a source of sacred knowledge. So in this hadith, the Prophet Muhammad instructs believers to both tie one's camel and trust in Allah or God. So the toolkit introduction reads, every day we are dealing with racist violence and anti-Muslim bigotry, while also coping under the weight of a global health crisis that is disproportionately killing our communities. And the current election season has only amplified these pressures. So what does this all mean? It means that we must be prepared in every way possible for days, weeks, and months to come. So we first and foremost put our trust and faith in Allah as the all-knowing, merciful creator. And then we tie our proverbial camel. We get prepared by naming and acknowledging the source of oppression, white supremacy. We get prepared by acquiring the knowledge and resources to help us make the most well-informed decisions for ourselves and our communities. We get prepared by grounding ourselves in the healing practices which fortify us and enable us to weather any storm. We will need healing in order to continue to resist. So this election wellness toolkit circulated very widely on Muslim Twitter and Instagram and other social media sites. And again, it's meant as a kind of resource for Muslims of all ethnic identities, all subjected to in varying ways to systems of racial oppression rooted in logics of both anti-Blackness and colonialism. So asserting the direct impact of colliding socio-political conditions on the overall well-being and agency of oppressed minorities, MWF again links healing and wellness to certain kinds of racial political consciousness, certain kinds of religious ethics, and intentional practices of here preparation. So the toolkit goes on to identify, as you'll have seen if you clicked on the thing, these 7 dimensions of election wellness. And unfortunately don't have time to go into any of them, but each one basically prescribes specific ways to conceptualize and work towards these different forms of wellness. So in this way, wellness is positioned as a kind of agentive process sanctioned by God. The toolkit instructs US Muslims to sort of face off with these colliding forces of COVID-19 and white supremacy, to prepare and to mobilize. But to my reading, this isn't simply as a kind of invitation to do to good actions or good citizenship. It's not even framed really as a kind of self-preservation. It's really framed as a kind of religious obligation. And this way, wellness is presented as a kind of idealized collection of intersecting knowledges and practices. It's kind of a condition of being towards which one can strive through praxis. So, and I'm super overtime always. So it's thus my preliminary contention that the discourse of Muslim wellness can neither be dismissed as a kind of unremarkable, just an Islamic translation of popular American wellness culture, nor do I think it can be conceived simply as a kind of mental health intervention rooted in clinical best practices. Rather, I think Muslim wellness is better interpreted as a prescriptive kind of ethical project that names critical racial consciousness and political activism as part and parcel of what it means to be a good Muslim. So more specifically, I see in the MWF's concept of wellness, and of course its kind of percolations in the work of the National BMCC, as a project of ethical formation enabled through the growing prominence of these organizations and their leaders as sites of religious authority. So Muslims across the country follow these leaders on social media and participate in their organizational programming. So in this sense, Muslim wellness offers sort of normative knowledge about God, self, society, all of which enjoins the cultivation of a certain repertoire of practices. So Muslim wellness, I think, sort of carries this projective quality in that it presupposes that the work of becoming well is deeply interconnected with the work of liberation. So these two things are, sort of simultaneous, and they're also both deeply rooted in one's relationship with God. So for the organizers behind the MWF and National BMCC, being Muslim and being well are both sort of these processes of becoming. They're aspirations that guide praxis towards two intersecting ideals of sort of perfected faith and a perfected or healed social world in which white supremacy is eradicated and sort of justice reigns. So by parsing the logic of Muslim wellness, we see how the National BMCC's needs-based sort of sociological response to the intersecting crises of COVID-19, systemic racism, and rising fascism is underwritten by its lead organizers' much broader faith-based vision of collective liberation and social renewal. So moving now swiftly to my conclusion, the mere presence of the National BMCC and its parent organizations on this National Muslim Task Force that I mentioned earlier, I think in itself sort of speaks to the impact of a growing Muslim anti-racist movement. Movement leaders, including Rashad and Hill, encourage US Muslims of all ethnic backgrounds to work in solidarity with the Black and Black Muslim cause, seeing their shared fate tied to the upending of these intersecting systems of racism, policing, and surveillance at the hands of a colonial and white supremacist state. So while I don't think we can identify this discourse of wellness detailed here as some sort of like novel production, uniquely inspired by the COVID crisis. I do think it's been this moment of sort of co-pandemic collision and sort of national racial reckoning that has catalyzed these existing networks of Muslim anti-racist activism. And in so doing has propelled Black-centered sort of race-critical modes of being Muslim and being well further into the mainstream of US Muslim life. So I do think more work needs to be done, not only on the sort of historical roots of this discourse, there's much to be said, I think, and the connection of this discourse to otherwise somewhat nebulous American wellness culture. But I also think more work can be done as well on the ability of this discourse to actually impact US Muslim religious belief and political participation on the ground. So how are average Muslims with differing identities and stakes encountering and enacting this sort of prescriptive discourse in their everyday lives, especially when the primary mechanism for encountering this discourse, at least for the last year, has been on the internet. So as the United States implements these wide-scale vaccination plans and begins to put a bookend on the sort of immediate devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, scholars of American religion must attend to how religious actors of all political stripes have interpreted a vast landscape of intersecting social ills and then prescribed ethical solutions to meet the moment. As the catalyzing power of these co-pandemics sort of subsides and religious communities return to traditional or reimagined forms of ritual and gathering, like what will be the lasting influence of the energies of the COVID moment, especially on how religious actors sort of think the body, think disease, think race and social ethics. And for me, I think wellness culture has offered one point of entry. There are, of course, mounting criticisms of wellness as just another kind of like capitalist meat grinder that channels all forms of resistance into passivity. But the hopeful notion that we might be something different than we were before, I think has resonated with many during the COVID-19 crisis, especially judging by the number of op-eds on this issue since March. So the program of Muslim wellness at the heart of the national BMCC also professes a kind of renewed way of seeing and becoming that, to my reading, connects the journey of Muslim faith and critical praxis to this ultimate goal of collective liberation. So that is all for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Yes, let's offer some praise for a wonderful presentation. Thank you. So in the spirit, again, of my forgetfulness, we're going to ask Dawrell to provide his 2 to 3 minute response to Lucy's presentation. And then I would like to honor Lucy by telling everyone her bio that she sent us all. So let's go in that order. So Dawrell, you have the floor again.
Thank you. Lucy, thank you for such a robust writing and research there. And before I actually dive into some of the notes I had taken as you were speaking, I also want to say thank you for giving us some inroads into something we don't often hear about. And that is the work of Muslim communities in public health, and particularly Black health. So I'm grateful for that. There are a number of things as you were speaking that came to mind. I'll do my best, again, as you did, to kind of truncate this within the 2 to 3 minutes. But the first thing I want to note is your use of I can't breathe to point to this idea of co-pandemics that currently exist, i.e., so there is the viral infection, but also the sustaining of racial oppression and white supremacy. And as you were speaking about these co-pandemics, again, from my interdisciplinary realm, automatically my mind went to environmental toxins. It went to public health directly on account of living in divested communities that are rife not just with drugs, not just with looting, but with toxic waste incinerators, with landfills. And so I know you didn't name that, but as soon as you said that, I thought, wait a minute, this kind of tripod, if you will, this trico-pandemic of viral infection, racial oppression, and then environmental injustice. And so I'm glad that you wove that together. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to note was your naming of wellness culture, and how these transcendent ideas abound concerning it, which point to the conflict between the individual and communal. And I appreciated this because within the wellness culture, again, to name what you named, this idea of, being the best version of yourself, or living your best life, and living in optimal health. But as you were speaking, especially from a framework of Black Muslims, I thought to myself, what is the voice? What is the voice of religious folk in the wellness conversation, though? And how are religious folk, be they Black Christian, Black Muslim, whatever, how are they pushing back against this wellness culture, which seeks primarily to push individualism? And what are the ways in which we're countering that as religious folk? So that's something that I guess I'll have to do some more research into, but I thank you for sparking that. And because we are still in a Judeo-Christian hallmark society, I think the work that you just did of raising the voices, or just giving space for us to hear, again, how Black Muslims are working towards health, and particularly Black Muslim women, their role in this. I think that is disruptive work that you just did for us. And for that, I'm also grateful. And the last thing I want to point out is this, which really, really struck me, I think, maybe even more than everything I've named, is healing as political, and the move you made towards liberation. As soon as I heard you say those words, that the politics of healing, automatically my mind went to the interplay between religious communities and the profession of miraculous healing, and the profession, the claim of miraculous healing, and what that might look like in conversation with pharmaceutical companies. What does the politics of healing, a conversation of the politics of healing, what might that sound like between Moderna and Pfizer and someone who had COVID but did not take these vaccines? I'm just, you sparked so much with that. Again, and I don't think it's something that we actually often connect. That move towards liberation and the process of becoming, and this will be the last thing I share, the process of becoming reminded me of Catherine Keller's work. She's at Drew University, and the work she does surrounding constructive theology, but her language that there actually exists indeterminate becomings. And I love that language, indeterminate possibilities for what or who we could be. And so I think that language, her language there of indeterminate becomings, speaks volumes to the work that these Black Muslim women are doing within their context. It is a move towards indeterminate becomings, indeterminate health and wellness. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dawrell. Those were wonderful ruminations, and I'm sure both of you, excellent scholars, have kept track of what you've said, but I've written some things down in case we need reminders later. Let me now just give Lucy's bio, because we all deserve to hear it. Lucy Ballard is a PhD candidate in the study of religion at Harvard University. Her research is situated in the fields of contemporary Islamic studies, American religion, and critical racial and ethnic studies. She is currently working on a dissertation that uses mixed ethnographic, textual, and digital methods to examine contemporary Muslim anti-racist activism in the United States. Originally from North Carolina, Lucy holds an MTS in Islamic Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a BA in Religious Studies from Appalachian State University. So now let's move on to Dr. Ospino, who's going to provide some initial reactions to both papers. And then Dr. Ospino is going to give a panelist a question to which they'll have about 2 to 3 minutes to respond.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So here's what I am going to propose. First of all, congratulations on these 2 excellent papers. No? Food for thought, and for those of you who are witnessing this conversation, just know that Lucy and Dawrell are the experts, and I'm not gonna, actually I'm not an expert on Muslim studies, and I am not an expert on African traditions or the type of religious analysis that you are doing, no? So what I read your papers in light of my expertise. I'm a professor of practical theology and religious education. And the way I read your papers is, what can we learn? What do we learn from your essays, from your papers, for a better study of religion, society, politics? No, so how do we do this? What do we learn? What is it that I see that the 2 of you are doing? So let me just offer some general highlights. As I promised you, this is not a full-blown response, and it's not going to be a critique. It's not going to be a test either. So as I said, it's your essays, bring very important insights for us as a community of scholars, in particular scholars of religion, theologians, to imagine how do we analyze, the questions that are emerging in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly, I think that Lucy's essay also brought up the important observation that this is not an isolated pandemic. We are living in between these 2 co-pandemics, racism, COVID-19. But there are other pandemics that are also happening in our society. If we wanna, for instance, add ideological polarization, which is something that is preventing us from moving forward as a society. There is also the pandemic of a sick nationalism that has emerged in our society that has an anti-immigrant element. It's racist, it's anti-immigrant, but it's also anti-constitutional in many ways, and it has severe consequences for the type of work that we do, either as scholars or as ministers or as educators in this particular society. From Lucy's paper, I want to highlight a few key points that I find helpful. On the one hand, I want to thank Lucy for bringing attention to the concept of wellness and its intersection, to social and political dimensions with the community. I myself come from a family, in both my parents, my brother, work in the healthcare system. My brother is married to a nurse, and it's just everybody in my family is this. And there's a particular sensibility that I have also towards wellness, and I understand what you're saying. And what I find interesting in these particular papers is that connection between wellness and the cultivation of the self, and a self not in isolation, but a self inserted in a particular community. So what you have presented us in your paper is not merely just an exercise of how do we look at wellness as a phenomenon isolated from from the realities of a particular community, but you have inserted it, in the everyday life. And I think that as scholars of religion, what you're doing here is paving the way or inviting us methodologically to be more attentive to, one, the importance of lo cotidiano, the everyday, the quotidian, in our exercise of religious scholarship, but on the other, the role of communion. A second point I would highlight from your essay, Lucy, is the communal dimensions of sin. Dimensional and again, I'm using a very Christian category, theologically speaking. But what I find interesting is that the two groups that you have described and the practices that they have developed also model what we could call communal responses to sin. So we got these two dynamics, communal dimensions of sin, structural sin, political sin, racism, and all the isms that we encounter in our society, but also how we encounter in the community embedded practices and responses to sin. So those embedded responses to sin challenge individualistic approaches that predominate in our culture to speak of realities like racism, anti-immigration, discrimination, sexism, and any other isms that we find. So these two dynamics, in many ways, reveal the intersectionality of, on the one hand, of race and injustice, but the responses also invite us into to look at the dynamics of racial justice and building the common good, and how these two function together. Three, your essay, Lucy, also invites us as scholars of religion and as theologians to pay closer attention to the intracommunal tensions that we have in minoritized communities throughout the United States, particularly on questions of racial and ethnic cultural self-definition. I found it quite interesting when you indicated that 20 to 30% of all Muslims in the United States of America self-identify as Black, And that reminded me of the work that I do with Hispanics in the United States of America. In the Hispanic community, there's a similar dynamic as well, In the Hispanic community, we tend to speak of Hispanics in general as a brown community, quote unquote. Yet we know for a fact that about a full quarter of all Hispanics in this country are Black, And somehow by just reducing the entire Latino community to being brown, somehow we miss that dimension of racial self-identification right here in terms of Blackness, but also the fact that there are many Hispanics who are indigenous, many Hispanics who are white as well. So the blurring of racial divides with one category, brown, somehow calls for particular attention when we enter into these communities. How do we define them and how do we allow them to self-define? And lastly, I think that something that emerges strongly from your essays, or from your particular essay, Lucy, is the importance for scholars of religion and theologians to find a correlation, and I want to actually modify this word, to find a constructive and mutually critical correlation between our categories, the categories that we see, for instance, salvation, sin, grace, and so on, and the already existing categories in the different communities that we serve or that we study. I was fascinated by looking at the texts and the pedagogical resources of the organizations that you studied. And as a matter of fact, I spent some time on their websites just looking at the different language. And it's just beautiful language, that if one looks at it from a theological perspective, there's so much richness in there. However, we must be careful not to co-opt the language that these people have created in light of particular circumstances and pressures that they may be experiencing, and not just simply reduce them to, once again, sin, grace, salvation, and so church, and on. From Dawrell's paper, I want to highlight also a few points. There's so much in your paper. I think that you have about 3 or 4 books that you could write out of this particular paper. And one thing that that caught my attention and I find very important is many communities nowadays, as we study religion, are deeply engaged on the task, or rather the quest of construction of identity, construction of communal identity. And this process of constructing identity as a community has a dual dynamic, that I see happening in your particular essay. On the one hand, there is an element of reconstruction. When you look back at the experience of Africans who were brought into the United States, what was lost, what was retained, what was transformed, what remained hidden, And on the other hand, there is a dynamic of deconstruction, that needs to happen as well as these different practices and different traditions, What I would encourage you at some point, Dawrell, is to bring into this particular analysis some work, from someone like, David Tracy, theologian David Tracy, looking at hermeneutics. David Tracy speaks about the work of hermeneutics, that every hermeneutical process, needs to have a process of retrieval, which you began doing in this particular essay, but also a hermeneutics of critique and a hermeneutics of suspicion. And I think that you got the kernels of all these 3 already in this particular essay that made really take this project to only God knows what levels, but certainly very good levels of inquiry. Ritual. Fascinating to imagine the ritual that emerges here. And ritual, I think that in your study, in this short paper, you have pointed us in the direction of being more attentive to how ritual and worship practices, sustain identity on the one hand, but also, are tools for the community, particularly for minoritized communities in a society like the United States of America, to retain their voice, to affirm their voice, to remain prophetic. Your analysis on dancing and shouting, it's fascinating, and the use of masks, in the tradition and its potential. Now, I was a bit curious, somehow you begin with a bit of a hermeneutics of retrieval, with of masks and their use in worship or their use in society. And, but at some point towards the end, you somehow abandoned that exercise of retrieval. And I want to ask you a question about this. That's going to be one of my questions for you. In terms of ritual and worship, I observe, I think it's important to observe, and this is something that you don't have to do, but I, as a Roman Catholic, practical theologian, your essay has inspired me, for instance, to look at the use of the equivalent to masks, in our current worship, and how that is being used. I was imagining, one of the questions as I read your essay that I asked myself is, what about if we were to right now, bring the use of masks, into liturgical practice? What would that look like, whether it's in a Black community, but also in a Latino community. There are indigenous communities in the Latino culture, Latin American cultures, Caribbean cultures that actually retain that use in those practices. But your essay was, I was imagining, for instance, not everyone, we don't, when we go to worship in a Catholic church, we do not see people wearing masks, but we see a few people, wearing vestments, of different colors. And those people wearing the vestments and wearing different ornaments and a number of dynamics that, identify them, as separate. These people, are ordained. They are male. They are separated from the community in terms of space and in terms of status. And I'm thinking, that your essay in many ways is an invitation to imagine how the use of masks, is also a cautious invitation to determine, how people in the community are sorted out, by that particular use. And finally, in the essay that you wrote, Dawrell, is once again, a reminder in our field of the study of religion and the study of theology, particularly in our contemporary world, that we all must become bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual vis-a-vis methodologies that we engage and embrace for interdisciplinary work. I think that gone are the days when we will find a theologian who is mostly a theologian or only a theologian, or a biblical scholar who is only X or Y. I think that your conversation with Carol Finley's work, in anthropology is just fascinating. The question for us, eventually will be, when we engage in these conversations, let's take the retrieval of masks or the use of masks, from the perspective that you used. We need to ask ourselves, and this is at the practical level, I'm thinking faith in the community, faith in the everyday life, worship on Sundays or so, what is possible, what is ideal, what does our particular context allow, and from what, from a particular context, from our own particular context, how do we retrieve and interpret or reinterpret those practices that are retrieved? So these are some of the initial insights that I have. Again, always imagining what does it mean to be, a scholar of religion, and how can we teach religion? How can we be taught, or engage in these dialogues? So I know that we got about 13 minutes, and most likely you're not gonna respond to all the answers and so on, but I'm going to co-opt Nathan's role here, if you would allow me, Nathan, okay? So I just wanna invite you, perhaps, in light of what you heard, just react, and not to my talk, but you heard Lucy, you heard, Lucy, you heard Dawrell as well in some interesting questions. What would be some of your own thoughts as you continue to evolve in these conversations? And if we have some time, then we may pick up a couple of questions, okay? So why don't you, Lucy, why don't you begin, since Dawrell began earlier?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Espino. Yeah, so I have a lot of sort of thoughts and reactions to all of the conversation we've had so far. Two maybe specific points I would pick up on from your response, Dr. Espino. So you mentioned that one sort of overarching conversation that we're having at this conference is, what are the questions that are emerging from the pandemic moment for religious life in the United States? And how can we as scholars channel our sort of methodologies and sort of theoretical thinking to answer those questions, that it might ask new things of us. And I was thinking in part just about sort of how my own paper came to be, like what inspired me to write this paper. And I suppose what it was is really just feeling, as you mentioned in your own life, Dr. Espino, sort of being surrounded by the constant language of health and disease. And yeah, even wellness, the threat of being unwell. Constantly, this is like, has been my experience for months and months, just anxieties around disease, constantly being surrounded by the vocabulary of medicine and health. So I started to think, like, what do we make of the use of this medicalized language around race and racism? And in part, I was inspired as well, like two of those like popular anti-racist books that were really popular, especially with white audiences over the summer, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy. Both of these books talk about racism using analogies to the body and to disease. Like racism is a disease that lives within you. You just have to root it out like a cancer. That's, I think, Layla Saad's sort of take. So I started wondering, like, why is this language so powerful and compelling? Why does it keep showing up? Is there a longer trajectory of this language? That's not a question I can answer yet. But like, why is it so compelling in this particular moment? And especially, I am thinking now as well, will this medicalized language sit differently with us now? I'm assuming that Kendi and Saad wrote their books ahead, at least a year before the pandemic began. So would they approach this issue differently? And then that sort of brought me to the language of wellness, looking at this specific Muslim sort of social response to the pandemic. So what is the structure of this discourse of wellness? Like, what does it mean to be well? Which asked me both as asked me as a scholar to ask these questions of myself, but also to think about how my interlocutors, these particular groups of especially Black and Muslims of color, how are they thinking about wellness and what it means to be unwell? And then also I was thinking as well about the ways in which the pandemic has asked us to exist in a whole other space than we had before. Our entire lives are now lived online, constantly talking to flat people on screens. So I saw this as kind of a renewed opportunity to kind of explore the role of digital media in cultural production, in anthropology especially. Traditionally speaking, anthropologists don't view digital space as a legitimate sort of authentic field site on its own merits. And so I sort of saw this as an opportunity to really dive into, what are these networks of digital exchange and interaction, and how are they shaping people's political identities? So that's sort of like some of the bigger questions that the paper revolves around. And I also just wanted to mention as well quickly, I know I'm very wordy, your comment about how scholars can navigate sort of emic and edic categories. So like categories used by the community, understudy, and academic categories. And I was challenged by this question because I initially went off on this big search to find like, well, what are the Muslim, sort of traditional Muslim Islamic language around purification and sort of holistic health and growth and development. And there are concepts. Tazkiyah is one, kind of purification of the heart. Tarbiyah is another one that's more about sort of how you raise especially raise children to have good moral character. But then I thought, well, these categories aren't being used by the people under question, at least not in their sort of digital output. So that led me to perhaps put those categories aside and focus more on the actual discourse of wellness itself as they were using it. So those are just two sort of things that came to mind and from your response.
Wonderful, thank you. Dawrell.
Dr. Ospino, thank you for lending your comments, your voice to my essay. I'd like to, I think, lift up two things, namely, and the first is the idea of ritual that you raised, and how through the reading you saw that I was attempting to be attentive to ritual as a way to sustain identity and as a tool for community to retain its voice. And I know you hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head for that, because that is a part of my intentional work. What I'm saying is that while there is a forward move, we also have to recall that that there has been a past, that there has been a formidable past that we must not only reconcile with, but we also must build upon. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that that language is coming from my architecture background, that you do not get rid of the foundation of the thing, but you work with that and you build upon it. And from a lot of my experiences and even in some of the work that is burgeoning out of Black church studies, it is at times can be this forward move in forgetting the past. But I see the work of C. Eric Lincoln, I see the work of Rabatel, I see the work of Frank Thomas and many others, Anthony Penn, as this reclamation. It is this reclamation. It is the intentional reclaiming and also acknowledgement that what the Black church is and what it can be, that here comes again that indeterminate becoming, what it can be will always be steeped in what came before. It'll always be steeped in the drumming. It'll always be steeped in that sound, in the shouting. So I wanted to voice that, but also I wanted to really get to your question of the mask and almost my abandoning of it in the end. Now, that move that I made, or I attempted to make there, was because in my research, there are very few spaces, Black church spaces, that have willfully retained use of masks. And by that, I mean this. In the worship experience, in the moment, in the sacred liturgy, I have come across very, very few who are doing that. But I am familiar with churches like Mount Airy Baptist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with Reverend Dr. Anthony Bennett, with Trinity United Church of Christ, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, and St. Paul Community Baptist Church in Brooklyn. These churches have all been very intentional to, again, retain, to acknowledge the past, the historical past, through what is called the Ma'afa. And Ma'afa is a Kiswahili term, which means the great calamity. Ma'afa, M-A-A-F-A. And this Ma'afa, these Ma'afa events, they are an intentional time where they actually memorialize and commemorate the transatlantic slave trade and the trajectory of the Black experience in America. And as you were speaking, I noted for myself, I said, oh, wow, interesting. Because they are doing this intentional work of reclaiming, of acknowledging the ancestors, and are seeking to remain grounded in that, it's not difficult for me to see those spaces actually incorporate masks in the worship space. That's not difficult. But by and large, by and large, it's not difficult for me to see other Black churches who are not intentionally doing that work resist it and say, well, again, all of the stereotypes, all of the cultural appropriations, all of the other stuff that we have been indoctrinated with concerning things African. And so as soon as we hear African religion, automatically some folks' minds goes to voodoo, it goes to witchcraft. And so there's these other kind of notions and ideas that we have to get beyond in order for something like this to work. And so when you see me make that move to say, well, even if masks are abandoned in our worship spaces, it's okay because we still have the drum, we still have the dance, we still retain the song. Those other things those other cultural productions are of equal value to that mask. And so that was that move that I made. And I think, yeah, those two things I'll raise up. I know we have just about a minute or so, but thank you for your comment there. Yeah.
No, and thank you both of you for definitely, I mean, your reactions to these ideas. And again, the whole point of this conversation is how do we take this, to the next level and continue to imagine, possibilities. So I deeply, I'm deeply grateful to both of you for those insights. And I know that we are about, time, and
Yeah.
Nathan, what do you suggest we do?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to break off from one another. I want to thank Dawrell and Lucy and Dr. Ospino for their wonderful presentations and responses. It's been a blessing to hear from everyone and to be in a little bit of community with each other in our flat faces, as Lucy said. But thank you for giving us something to enrich our lives to think about. So let's have a break. If you're attending another concurrent session, the next one is going to be after a little bit of a break. It'll start at 1:30. So everyone go and have a wonderful piece of your afternoon. And thank you again for joining us.
Best wishes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.